When armed men came to seize his family farm, the elderly rancher revealed why he had chosen this specific location 20 years ago and why leaving was never an option. What they discovered would expose a network of strategic positions that had been secretly defended for decades and prove that some pieces of American soil were worth dying for. Samuel Reed had been ranching the Whitewater Valley for 22 years, and every morning he walked the same perimeter check that kept him alive during 3 decades of the most dangerous military operations in American history. At 71, neighbors saw him as a successful cattle rancher who minded his own business. What they didn't see was how his land controlled access to 3 major highways, 2 railroad lines, and the primary water supply for 4 counties. The Whitewater Valley wasn't just prime agricultural land, it sat at the convergence of transportation corridors that connected the industrial Midwest with Pacific ports. More importantly, it controlled the headwaters of the Snake River system and access to the Grand Coulee Dam complex. In hostile hands, this single property could be used to disrupt transportation, communication, and power generation across hundreds of thousands of square miles. The first sign of trouble appeared on Monday when black SUVs started conducting surveillance of his property boundaries. Samuel's operational instincts, refined through years of Special Forces missions, immediately cataloged the threat. Professional surveillance team, rotating shifts, expensive equipment. These weren't real estate developers or government inspectors. These were operators preparing for something big. Samuel had been expecting this day for over 2 decades. His ranch wasn't just 800 acres of prime cattle country. It was the most strategically important piece of land in 3 states, capable of controlling transportation and resources across hundreds of square miles. In the wrong hands, his property could become a staging area for operations that could cripple the entire region. But Samuel Reed wasn't really a rancher. He was Colonel Samuel Reed, former commander of the 7th Special Forces Group, architect of Operation Granite Shield, and the man who'd identified dozens of strategic choke points that required permanent protection. The government had needed him to disappear so he could guard this position without anyone knowing it was being defended. Operation Granite Shield had been classified at levels that made normal black ops look like public information. The program identified critical infrastructure control points across America and placed elite military personnel in deep cover to guard them. Samuel's ranch was Position 7 Alpha, one of 43 strategic locations that could determine the outcome of any conflict on American soil. The surveillance lasted 3 days before they made their move. 6 armed contractors in tactical gear approached his farmhouse Wednesday morning with the coordinated movement of professional military personnel. Their leader, calling himself Marcus Webb, claimed to represent interstate land development and demanded immediate evacuation for urgent infrastructure improvements. Samuel played the confused rancher perfectly, but Webb wasn't buying the performance. When Webb produced documentation claiming eminent domain authority, Samuel's decades of experience with classified operations let him spot multiple forgeries immediately. These weren't government agents. They were private contractors working for someone who wanted his land badly enough to risk federal crimes. Webb's team had done their homework, but not well enough. They knew the land was strategically valuable, but they didn't understand why or how it had been defended. When Webb mentioned geological surveys showing underground installations, Samuel realized they detected some of his defensive preparations, but had no idea of their true scope. Webb's mistake was mentioning Operation Granite Shield and asking why a dead Special Forces officer's name appeared on the property deed. That's when Samuel realized this wasn't just about his land. Someone had been hunting for him specifically, tracking down classified assets who were supposed to be buried in military records forever. The intelligence leak was worse than Samuel had feared. Webb's team knew about Operation Granite Shield, they knew about the strategic choke points, and they knew the identities of at least some of the operators guarding them. Someone with access to the highest levels of military intelligence was selling America's most critical secrets to hostile forces. The confrontation escalated when Webb demanded access to the ranch's communications equipment and defensive installations. Samuel's response was to ask how Webb knew about equipment that didn't officially exist. Webb's answer revealed the scope of the threat they were facing. Someone had leaked classified information about strategic defensive positions across the entire country. Samuel looked at the armed contractors and made the calculation that had governed his survival through decades of impossible missions. When he identified himself using authentication protocols that made Webb's confidence evaporate into growing alarm, the contractor realized he wasn't facing a stubborn rancher. He was facing one of the most dangerous men in American military history. But Samuel's revelation triggered an immediate escalation. Webb's team wasn't equipped to handle a special forces colonel who'd spent 22 years preparing defensive positions. When Samuel activated systems that turned his ranch buildings into surveillance posts and defensive positions, the contractors understood they were dealing with a fortress designed by someone who knew exactly what he was protecting. The ranch's defensive systems had been 22 years in the making. What looked like ordinary farm buildings actually contained surveillance equipment, communication centers, and weapons caches that could support extended combat operations. Samuel's cattle weren't just livestock. They were part of an early warning system that could detect intrusion from miles away. Webb's radio crackled with urgent reports from his backup teams. More vehicles were approaching the property, but they weren't reinforcements for the contractors. They were federal agents who'd been tracking the same intelligence leak that had led hostile forces to Samuel's position. The ranch was about to become the center of a three-way firefight. Samuel's operational assessment was grimly professional. The contractors were trapped between his defensive positions and incoming federal forces, but they had capabilities he hadn't expected. When Webb's team produced military-grade weapons and tactical equipment, Samuel realized this wasn't just a land grab. This was a military operation designed to seize and hold strategic terrain. The first exchange of gunfire came when Webb's team tried to breach the main ranch house. Samuel's defensive preparations included overlapping fields of fire that turned every approach into a kill zone, but the contractors had night vision equipment and coordinated tactics that showed professional military training. This wasn't going to be easy. What happened next demonstrated why certain strategic positions required protection by the most elite operators in American military history. Samuel's defensive preparations, developed over 22 years of ranching, turned his property into a tactical fortress that could withstand assault while protecting the critical infrastructure it controlled. The contractors discovered that every barn, fence line, and water tank had been positioned for defensive advantage. Samuel's cattle weren't just livestock. They were early warning systems trained to react to unauthorized intrusion. His ranch roads weren't just farm tracks. They were kill zones designed to channel attackers into predetermined positions. But Webb's force was larger than Samuel had anticipated. When additional teams arrived with heavy weapons and communications jamming equipment, Samuel realized this was a coordinated assault designed to overwhelm his defenses through superior firepower. Someone had studied his capabilities and planned accordingly. The battle for the Whitewater Valley raged for 6 hours. Samuel used every defensive advantage his ranch offered, turning 22 years of agricultural work into a coordinated military campaign. His intimate knowledge of the terrain, combined with prepared positions and cached supplies, allowed him to fight a force 3 times his size to a standstill. Federal forces arrived to find Samuel coordinating a defensive operation that had neutralized the contractor threat while protecting critical infrastructure from sabotage. His 22 years of ranching had been preparation for defending one of America's most important strategic choke points from enemies who understood its true value. But the attack on Samuel's ranch was only the beginning. Webb's intelligence leak had exposed dozens of strategic positions across the country, each one defended by military personnel operating under deep cover. Samuel's successful defense had prevented one choke point from falling, but the war for America's critical infrastructure was escalating rapidly. The federal investigation revealed the true scope of the threat. Webb's contractors were part of a larger organization that had been planning simultaneous attacks on strategic positions across multiple states. Samuel's defense had prevented the capture of Position 7 Alpha, but intelligence indicated that similar assaults were being planned against other Granite Shield locations. As federal teams secured the Whitewater Valley, Samuel coordinated with other defensive positions that were under similar attack. The network of strategic defenders that had been operating in secret for decades was being forced into the open by enemies who'd penetrated the highest levels of military intelligence. Samuel's after-action report would document the first successful defense of a Granite Shield position against coordinated assault. His 22 years of ranching had provided perfect cover for defensive preparations that turned agricultural land into an impregnable fortress capable of controlling regional transportation and resources. The intelligence analysis revealed disturbing patterns. The attacks weren't random. They were part of a carefully planned campaign to seize control of America's most critical infrastructure control points. Someone had been studying the Granite Shield program for years, identifying weaknesses and developing strategies to neutralize America's strategic defenses. Samuel understood that his decades of peaceful ranching were finished forever. The attack had exposed programs that were supposed to remain classified, forcing acknowledgement of defensive assets that officially didn't exist. His quiet life as a cattle rancher was ending, but his real mission was finally being recognized as critical to national security. The federal investigation continued for months, but the implications were immediate. If hostile forces could identify and attack Granite Shield positions, America's entire strategic defense structure was compromised. Samuel's successful defense had bought time, but it had also revealed how vulnerable the country's most important secrets really were. As military security teams established permanent protection for the Whitewater Valley, Samuel Reed began planning coordination with other strategic defenders who were facing similar threats. The rancher had been a cover story, but the land he'd protected was one of dozens of positions that could determine the outcome of conflicts that most Americans didn't know were being fought. The network of strategic choke points that Samuel had helped design was America's most important defensive secret. His successful defense of the Whitewater position had prevented enemy forces from gaining control of critical infrastructure, but the real battle for America's strategic locations was just beginning. Samuel's expertise would be crucial in redesigning America's strategic defenses for a new kind of warfare. His 22 years of successful deep cover had proven the program worked, but his exposure had also revealed how many enemies were working to destroy it. The country's survival might depend on a few dozen operators who officially didn't exist. The elderly rancher who'd spent 22 years appearing to raise cattle and grow crops was about to become acknowledged as one of the most important strategic planners in American military history. But first, he had to help coordinate the defense of positions that could determine whether America remained capable of defending itself from enemies who understood infrastructure warfare better than most generals. This remarkable story required extensive research to ensure accuracy in its strategic and military details. If you enjoyed discovering Colonel Reed's hidden mission, make sure to subscribe to Untold Legend Stories for more incredible tales of ordinary people protecting extraordinary secrets. Hit that notification bell and let us know in the comments what you thought of this amazing revelation. We publish new stories every day, and tomorrow's tale will show you that sometimes the most important battles are fought by people who appear to be living completely ordinary lives. Your support means everything to us.